All right, how's it going? My name is Greg. Today we're going to be looking at an overview of the different ATP pathways, catabolism of glucose, and catabolism of fat. And this is for Kin516 Advanced Exercise Physiology. All right, so first we're going to be looking at cellular respiration, which is the catabolism of glucose. Basically, this is a process of breaking down sugar molecules into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is an energy-rich, energy-potential compound that supplies energy to the cells so that they can perform work of the body. There are two types of cellular respiration. There's aerobic, which requires oxygen. So obviously when there isn't oxygen or when exercise is too intense that there isn't oxygen, we're not able to use this type of cellular respiration. And then there's anaerobic, which does not require oxygen. Aerobic respiration has three main stages, well, 3 to 4, but we're just going to be talking about the three main stages. Glycolysis is the main one that breaks down glucose into pyruvate. The Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain, the ETC, and then overall this produces a maximum of 36 ATP per molecule of glucose. And so I included the formula right there that you can see. So it's one molecule of glucose plus oxygen breaks down into carbon dioxide, water, and then the ATP. And then just like that, there's the anaerobic respiration, which is less efficient than the aerobic respiration. And that is because it uses less oxidizing agents in the ETC rather than using oxygen that have similar reduction potentials, but they produce less energy or they yield less ATP per molecule of glucose. So overall, anaerobic respiration produces a maximum or nets 2 ATP total. All right, so here we have a diagram of cellular respiration that actually breaks off and branches off into aerobic and anaerobic respiration. We start with glucose, one molecule of glucose. Enters glycolysis with the help of 2 ATP to jumpstart the process. This turns into 2 pyruvate molecules. From there, if oxygen is not present, such as anaerobic respiration, this enters fermentation, which produces lactic acid. Like we said before, this process is not as efficient. So we're not going to be going super into this process because it only nets about 2 ATP and creates lactic acid. And we'll talk about the limitations in slides following. And then there's aerobic respiration when oxygen is present. And so this little oxidative decarboxylation step, I'm not really counting it as a step, but it's where pyruvate and coenzyme A come together and form acetyl-CoA, which is used in the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, which is the next step after glycolysis that we were talking about. And then from here, it goes to the electron transport chain, and 32 ATP are kicked out of the ETC, which nets about 36 ATP total. Okay, so here's the next diagram that walks through phase 1 and phase 2, basically the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and then the ETC. So as we were talking about, pyruvate from glycolysis gets turned into acetyl-CoA using that linked step there, and then a massive amount of hydrogen ion or hydrogen atoms come out of the citric acid cycle and are transported to the ETC, while ATP, a small amount of ATP, I think it's 2 ATP, are generated in the citric acid cycle as well as the CO2. And then as we get to the ETC, that is where the most amount of ATP is generated, and it's somewhere around 32 ATP. And that's what we're looking at here. So net ATP from everything. It talks about the different hydrogen ions going through pyruvate, and it totals of 32 ATP. And then right into fat catabolism. So fat is essentially two parts. There is glycerol and there's fatty acids. And they come together and make triacylglycerol, which is basically fat. And fat supplies 30 to 80% of biological work energy. So we're going to talk about the glycerol system first. So glycerol degrades to pyruvate, which turns into acetyl-CoA, which enters the citric acid cycle, and then onto the ETC. And the complete breakdown of one molecule of glycerol equals 19 ATP. And then fatty acids kind of use a different pathway, and they transform into acetyl-CoA using coenzyme A during beta oxidation, and then are transported to the ETC. So both glycerol and fatty acids both end up at the ETC. Just fatty acids use beta oxidation, and we're going to see why in a second. So using beta oxidation is the biggest step, and it's why, as I'm going to discuss here in a second, it's why fatty acids using beta oxidation produces so much more ATP than going through the citric acid cycle. Because beta oxidation occurs and then electron transport train, one 18-carbon fatty acid molecule actually creates or produces 147 molecules of ADP phosphorylate, that phosphorylate to ATP during the ETC, or the electron transport chain step. So one triacylglycerol molecule, which equals 3 fatty acids, nets about 441 ATP. So overall, the glycerol and the fatty acids, they combine, and when they're totally broken down, when catabolism completely occurs fully for one fat molecule, it nets about 460 ATP. And lastly, the limitations and interactions between the two pathways. The cellular respiration pathway, which is comprised of the aerobic respiration. So specifically talking about the aerobic respiration portion, or the glucose breakdown when oxygen is present, it's obviously limited by the oxygen consumption. So we talk about exercise intensity. As exercise intensity increases, the availability of oxygen is going to decrease, and our ability of using the aerobic respiration pathway is going to decrease as well. So as exercise intensity increases and oxygen availability decreases, we're still going to be able to break down glucose, but it's only going to net about 2 ATP, because we're going to end up using anaerobic respiration, and it's also going to create lactic acid buildup, which makes it really difficult to exercise. So I just threw something in here too. So the increase of lactic acid equals the decrease in performance, and that is seen in studies and studies, which is why it's really hard to use glucose as exercise intensity increases. And so fat catabolism, fat becomes the primary energy fuel for exercise when long duration exercise depletes glycogen. And that leads us to our last question of the day. Why not just use fatty acid metabolism, or why not just use fat catabolism? Why not use fat as our primary source of fuel? And that is because fat only becomes a primary energy fuel when long duration exercise has depleted glycogen stores. And then also the other component to this is that the energy or the power output generated by fat catabolism is so much lower. It's about half of the energy output that's generated through cellular respiration, generated through the catabolism of glucose. And I think that's it for this presentation.